Hello, my name is Irene and I'm a registered dietitian, and today I have another pediatric nutrition case study on the topic of initiating enteral nutrition. As always, these case studies are 100% made up but based on a variety of my experiences. So today's case study scenario is patient H is a 5-year-old male with newly diagnosed severe oral dysphagia, status post-stroke. Patient has no significant past medical history and previously ate a normal diet but has an allergy to dairy products. Mom reports patient previously had good appetite prior to stroke and no nutrition questions or concerns. Mom does note that patient has always been on the thinner side but is following his curve well. Patient's current anthropometric measurements are 17 kilos weight and 110 centimeters height. At his 4-year-old well child visit, his anthropometrics were 15 kilos weight and 102 centimeters height. So first and foremost, we are always going to want to look at his anthropometrics first. So he is 5 years old, so we are going to plot him on the 2 to 20 CDC growth curve. And so at 5 years old or 60 months, he is 17 kilos and 110 centimeters. So as you can see, he is, on the slimmer side. So his height is pretty average and his weight is, a little bit smaller compared to his height. His BMI Z-score is negative 1.39, but mom says that he is, always kind of been this way. And let's look at what he was before. So at 4 years old or 48 months, he was 15 kilos and 102 centimeters. So as you can see, he was fairly similar before. So kind of always on the thinner side, like mom said. His height is pretty average. So obviously we looked at his growth curve and he looked to be pretty okay, but we want a little bit more tangible data. So we'll want to calculate his weight gain and his length gain velocity. So remember, this is always taking the current value minus the previous value and divide by the time in between. So we are assuming that 365 days passed in between these two data points. So we take his current weight minus his previous weight, which is 2 kilos, which we want in grams because we're calculating everything in grams. So that's 2,000 grams divided by 365 days. So we get about 5.5 grams per day of weight gain over the last 365 days. We're going to do the same thing with the height. So 110 minus 102 divide by 365. And so we get about 0.022 centimeters per day over the past 365 days of length gain. So we want to compare these to our weight gain goals for his age. So he's 5 years old. So our weight gain goals for 2 to 6 year old males are about 5 to 6 grams per day in terms of weight gain. And then in terms of height gain, it's 0.02 to 0.03 centimeters per day. And so he met both of these goals and is actually really right in between there. So looking at diagnosing malnutrition and what that criteria looks like, he would fall under the mild malnutrition diagnosis because his BMI Z-score is less than -1. So it does fall between -1 and -1.99. However, he's kind of always been on the smaller side. It's not like he's fallen off the curve or anything, and he hasn't had any deceleration in his BMI Z-score. I would say that in my clinical judgment, I would not diagnose the mild malnutrition at this point. I think that sometimes some kids are just smaller just in general, and that can be okay. If you go in the room and you see that mom and dad are both on the thinner side, you can probably guess that this is more genetic rather than actual malnutrition. So some people are just a little bit smaller and that's okay. When it's just very small deviation in BMI Z-score, I feel like that may not be enough evidence for me personally to diagnose this patient. I think I would need to have a little bit more information before I would diagnose that. So after reviewing his chart and looking at his anthropometric, you can go and talk with families. So let's say that you go and talk with mom who is at bedside and mom reports that patient used to eat a regular diet but has an allergy to dairy products that just causes some rashes. That's really the only thing that they avoid at home. She states that the patient has always had a good appetite and is not a picky eater, and patient was eating well up until his stroke, which happened yesterday. And he used to be really active, loved playing outside, but since having a stroke has now just gotten back to working with PT/OT to get some regular movement in. And then the following is a diet recall that we obtained from mom. So for breakfast, he has some cereal with almond milk or eggs and sausage. For mid-morning snack, he typically likes to get some peanut butter crackers. For lunch, he loves spaghetti and meatballs. And for an afternoon snack, mom likes to try and offer some fruit. And then for dinner, they usually sit down for a family meal consisting of some kind of protein, vegetable, and carbohydrates. And mom typically tries to stick with water mostly, but they do have some diluted juice occasionally. Mom estimates about 24 fluid ounces of water or other fluids during the day. And mom does say that he is on a daily chewable multivitamin just so that she can feel he is covering all of his bases. So it looks like clinically this kiddo is going to be mostly tube-fed dependent for the foreseeable future, meeting 100% of his needs. So some of the things that I take into consideration whenever I'm starting a brand new kid on some enteral nutrition is what their growth was like before, any allergies that they might have, any prior history of feeding intolerance. So prior to coming in, he was growing well on his curve, did not have any prior nutrition concerns. So we are not concerned about refeeding syndrome, and we can use the DRI to estimate his needs. If he had some other past medical history or some specific conditions, we may need to adjust our energy estimates, but because he's a pretty regular kid, I feel like the DRI does a pretty adequate job of estimating needs. For his dairy allergy, we will just need to be mindful of picking a formula that does not include dairy in it. So our options are Cape Farms or Complete, which are both pea-based formulas. And then he is a kid that was previously eating very well, eating a regular diet pattern, did not have any prior history of feeding intolerance. So he's probably one that would be a good candidate for bolus feedings. Typically when I'm starting a bolus feed, I would usually start with like a fourth or a third of our goal volume and advance by that same amount each feeding. If there were concerns about feeding intolerance in the past, or we just need to start slower for whatever reason, whether it's like they're in the ICU or something like that, for the younger kids I would typically start at 5 to 10 cc's per hour, and then for the older kids we can go up to 20 cc's per hour starting and advance by that same amount or as tolerated. So in terms of estimating needs, just based off of the diet recall and his growth curve, we can guess that he was probably meeting his kcal needs prior to admission. For estimating needs to determine tube feedings, we will use the DRI equation. So I have it pulled up here. The new DRIs that were released in 2023. Because he just had a stroke and he's really not as active as he was before, I'm going to use the inactive and the low active to be my lower and my upper bound for estimating calorie needs. So basically what I'll do is I'll just plug in the information. And of course we want everything in kcals per kilo. So for our lower bound, it's going to be 73 kcals per kilo. And for our upper bound, it's going to be 79 kcals per kilo. So for our tube feedings, we're going to want to shoot in between these two numbers. And then for fluid requirements, we are obviously going to use Holiday Seeker. So he is 17 kilos, so 7 kilos above 10, 7 times 50 and plus 1,000. So he needs 1,350 to meet 100% of his fluid requirement. And I like to meet a minimum of at least 80%. So my bare minimum that I want to meet is going to be 1,080 milliliters per day. So in terms of recommendations and coming up with our actual feeding plan, I am arbitrarily going to choose Complete Pediatric Standard 1.0, choosing it because it is our pea-based formula, so no dairy, and it is a 1.0 formula, so I feel like it is easier to meet fluid needs and also just easier for math. Obviously, if parents wanted to use the Cape Farms, I would happily give them a regimen for the Cape Farms. I'm just arbitrarily picking this one here. So looking at the nutrition facts, it comes in 250 ml cartons, and each carton has 250 calories in it. So our patient needs 73 to 79 kcals per kilogram per day, or about 1240 kcals to 1350 kcals per day. So if we just give him 5 cartons, that's going to be 1250 mLs or 1250 kcals per day, and that's going to meet within our range that we wanted. So I think that that is a great regimen to start this kid on. I like to do even numbers and make things easier for parents, so I would probably just do 1 carton 5 times a day. Obviously, if parents wanted to do less feedings or more feedings, that is totally fine. I kind of leave it up to them. I feel like in general, I like to allow the parents a lot more freedom in determining what their feeding schedule kind of looks like and what's going to work for them at home, because a lot of times in the hospital setting or just in medicine in general, there's a lot of things that they aren't able to control, and so feeding is one of the only things really that parents are able to control. And so I do want to allow them that freedom within reason though, so I'm always going to have the patient's interest in mind first and foremost, but I do want to allow parents some sort of leeway in determining what that kind of looks like for their kid. So in terms of of the actual regimen, if parents are totally okay with the 5 feedings a day, we can just do 1 carton each time. If they wanted to reduce it to 3 cartons a day, I'd probably say let's do 14 ounces 3 times a day, or 420 mLs 3 times a day. So this comes out to be a little bit more than the 1250 milliliters, and it doesn't exactly match up. Like, the 2 regimens aren't exactly the same, but I think that's okay. I'd rather something be a little bit easier than be so neurotic about keeping the numbers the same, unless there is a specific reason that we need to keep them the same, which sometimes there are. But in this case, I don't want parents to have to worry about measuring like 416 mLs of formula 3 times a day. I think that's just a little bit crazy. I like to make numbers nice and round and even as I'm able to, as long as I'm meeting the patient's need and not providing too much or too little of something. In terms of the time to feed, we typically default to running the feeds over an hour. Some kids can tolerate feeds run in 30 minutes, and so that is okay. Whatever the kid can tolerate, I really don't care. Some families also like to do like the gravity boluses, where they just pour it in and it just runs by gravity. Some kids are also able to tolerate a syringe bolus, so putting it in a large syringe and just like pushing it slowly, that is okay too. I think whenever we're first starting a tube feeding, we typically default to the pump though, and that is okay as well. Going back to making sure that we are meeting our patient's needs, so he's going to be getting 1250 calories per day, and so that comes out to about 74 kcals per kilogram per day. Looking at the protein, each carton provides 8 grams of protein, so 8 times 5 divided by 17, so he's getting 2.35 grams per kilo of protein every day. Our minimum for this age group is going to be 0.95 grams per kilo per day, and that sounds very low, and that's because it is the minimum. So generally a lot of kids meet between like 1.5 to 2.5 grams per kilo per day at this age. And then in terms of fluid needs, so each carton has 210 mLs of free water in it, so 5 cartons is going to give you 1050 mLs of free water. In terms of starting the feeds and initiating them, like I said earlier, I typically start with 1/4 to 1/3 of the total goal volume. So for him, we can start with 60 mLs and then advance by 60 mLs every feed until goal. So he would get to the goal within the first 24 hours of starting enteral nutrition. In terms of the free water, so the 1050 does fall a little bit shy of what our goal is of meeting 80% of his fluid needs. So I am going to recommend some water flushes. In general, for pediatric formulas, I do like to do some water flushes at the end anyways, just because it is a little bit thicker. And if you think about like if you have that formula sitting out like in a cup, it kind of gets a little crusty. And so like I don't want the inside of an NG tube to be crusty if you're going long periods of times without feeding through it. So I do like to do a little bit of a water flush. The minimum amount of water that you need to completely flush a NG tube kind of depends on the French size of it. For his age, we could just do an ounce of free water after every feed, so 30 mLs. I think that that's good and simple, quick push. 30 mLs would give us another 150 mLs of free water daily and bring our total to about 1200 milliliters of free water every day, which is going to meet about 89% of our fluid needs. The rest of our recommendations are kind of just going to be up to the medical team. So the PO diet is going to be up to the medical team and the speech language pathologist. That is their wheelhouse, and they will decide whether or not it is safe for the patient to eat with his dysphagia. So speech may want to work with him on his oral skills, or they may decide that he needs some texture modification. And then in terms of outpatient follow-up, I do want to make sure that they have some kind of follow-up with someone that is going to help with managing their feeds. For our institution, that is with our outpatient GI clinic, but for other institutions, it may be a little bit different, but it's just someone that is going to check in and make sure that we are on the right track and meeting our nutrition needs, not providing too much or too little of anything, that our patient is still growing adequately. Sometimes our DRIs or our estimates aren't completely accurate and we may overshoot or undershoot, so having that outpatient follow-up is super important and making sure that we catch those things earlier rather than later. But this concludes the case study. If you're looking for more content like this, I have a ton on my channel. Just look for the dietetics playlist. If you have other case study topics that you would like for me to do, please leave a comment down below. But I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please be sure to give it a like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time. Bye!